The fall had taken 3 days to stop feeling real. Not the fall from anything physical. Vera had not stumbled, had not been pushed. But Denmore was gone from her life as completely as if the ground had swallowed it, and the body took time to understand what the mind already knew. She had left. She was not going back. The road to Ashvale was 4 days on foot if the weather held. It did not hold. She spent the second night under a merchant's cart she had not asked permission to shelter beneath, listening to rain hammer the wood above her and trying to remember the last time she had slept somewhere with a door. The merchant discovered her at dawn and said nothing, which was its own kind of mercy. She reached the palace gates on the 4th afternoon with mud to her knees and a story she had rehearsed until it felt true. She was a laundress from a river village 2 weeks east. Her employer had died. She needed work. All of it constructed. All of it provable only if no one looked too closely at the village she had named. The guard at the servants' entrance was a broad man with the particular stillness of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything. He looked her over once. "Wolf?" "No," Vera said. He wrote something in his ledger. Not her name yet, just a mark, a category. She watched the pen move and understood immediately what she was in this place. A notation, not a person. "Laundry works the ground floor east wing," he said. "You'll be processed in the morning. Don't go above the 2nd floor." She did not ask what happened if she did. Her room was a narrow space off the servants' corridor with a straw mattress and a single window that faced the interior wall of another building. The candle on the shelf was burned to a stub. She did not light it. She sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and took stock of what she had. The clothes on her back, a small knife sewn into the hem of her skirt, and a wolf that had never once manifested in 24 years of living. She had known about it since she was 16. Her mother had guessed earlier, had watched Vera wake before storms hit and flinch at sounds no one else caught, and said nothing for years, hoping the signs would fade. They did not fade. When the Alpha of Denmore, a man named Brecht, began noticing the same things, her mother's silence became a different kind of fear. Vera had learned to be careful after that. Careful with her reactions, careful with her senses. Careful never to let her instincts show in ways that Brecht could point at and say, "There, that one. There is something worth selling." She had been careful for 8 years. It had not been careful enough. She lay down on the mattress without undressing and stared at the ceiling and did not let herself think about Denmore. Not the market square, not the houses, not the hill above the river where her mother used to go when she wanted to be alone, which Vera had not visited before she ran because visiting would have taken time she did not have. Morning came without announcement. She was already awake. The laundry was exactly what it looked like, hot, repetitive, and staffed by people who had sorted themselves by unspoken rules. She spent the first hour mapping. The 2 women nearest the large washing basin had been there longest. She could tell by the way they moved without looking, hands finding handles and ringing without pause. A younger girl worked the folding table and watched everything with the careful attention of someone still learning who mattered. A man named Holt processed her formally at the start of the shift. He was the king's beta, which she had not expected for a staff registration, and his presence changed the texture of the room. The other workers straightened without being told. He asked her name, her origin, her previous employer. She gave him the rehearsed answers. He wrote them down. Then he looked up from his ledger and held the look for a moment longer than record-keeping required. "You have no wolf," he said. Not a question. "No. Unusual for someone from Pack territory. My mother was human," Vera said. The wolf skipped. It was the explanation she had used before. It was plausible. Some wolves did skip generations, though it was rare, and the result was usually someone with faint shifter senses and no ability to shift, not someone with nothing at all, which was what Holt would detect if he pushed further. He did not push further. He made a note and moved to the next item on his list. But she felt his attention linger after his eyes had moved on, the way a hand lingers near a surface after the touch has ended. She filed that away and began her first shift. By the 3rd day, She had the layout of the ground floor memorized and most of the second. She had not gone above it. She had learned the names of 7 other servants, the schedule of the guard rotation through the main corridor, and the fact that the eastern staircase, the servants' stair, had no fixed post between the hours of 6 and 8 in the morning because the overnight guard's shift ended at 6 and the day post did not begin until 8. She had learned this because she noticed things. She had always noticed things. She had spent most of her life wishing she did not. On the 4th morning, she was alone in the laundry at 6:30, working through a pile of linens that had arrived the night before when she heard the stairs. Small footsteps. Uncertain but determined, the specific rhythm of someone who had to concentrate on each step. She set down the linen she was holding. A child appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 2 years old, with black hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of dark amber that swept the room once and then fixed on her with an attention that did not belong on a face that small. He was wearing a sleep shirt that was slightly too large. His feet were bare. Vera looked at him. He looked at her. She knew who he was. The servants talked, and the thing they talked about most was the prince who did not speak, the king's son who had not said a word in nearly 2 years, who refused every nursemaid eventually, who screamed through the nights often enough that the staff in the East Wing had learned to sleep through it. She also knew, with a practicality she did not bother dressing up, that a member of the royal family standing unsupervised in the laundry at 6:30 in the morning was a problem she did not want. "You need to go back upstairs," she said. He sat down on the floor. She looked at the doorway behind him. No guards, no nursemaid, no one. "I'm not," she started and stopped. There was no sentence that ended usefully. She was not equipped for this. She was not the right person. She was, in fact, precisely the wrong person, someone trying to remain unnoticed, and a lost prince in her laundry was the opposite of unnoticed. She crossed to the doorway and looked up the servant's stair. Empty. She looked back at the boy. He had not moved. He was watching her with those amber eyes, and something in the quality of his attention made the back of her neck prickle. Not danger, not fear, something that felt unnervingly like recognition. She crouched down to his level. "Who brought you downstairs?" He said nothing. "Did you come by yourself?" Nothing. But his eyes tracked her face the way her mother's eyes used to track storms through the window, with the certainty of someone reading something that had not happened yet. The door to the linen passage on the far side of the room opened, and 3 palace guards came through at a pace that was not quite running, followed by a woman in a nursemaid's uniform whose face had gone the particular gray of someone who had been searching for 20 minutes and had begun imagining consequences. They stopped when they saw the prince sitting on the laundry floor. The nursemaid exhaled and moved toward him. "Your Highness, come." The boy turned away from her. He did not make a sound. He simply turned his body toward Vera and leaned slightly, the way a person leans toward warmth without deciding to. The nursemaid reached for him. He moved closer to Vera. The guards looked at each other. Vera straightened. "I didn't bring him here," she said. "He came down the servant's stair. The East Post doesn't start until 8. "We know the schedule," the guard on the left said. His tone was not hostile, but it had weight in it. "You need to come with us. I'm a laundress." "You need to come with us," he said again. She looked at the boy. He was still watching her. His expression had not changed. That same settled, certain attention, as if her being taken away was a fact he had already accounted for and decided was temporary. She went with them. The interrogation room was on the 2nd floor, and Holt was already there when they arrived, which told her the news had moved faster than she had. He sat at the head of a narrow table with his ledger open and a cup of something cooling at his elbow. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up. She sat. "Explain your morning," he said. She explained it, all of it, in the same order it had happened, without elaboration. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical, none of them accusatory. She answered them the same way. When she finished, he looked up from his notes. "The door to the prince's room has a latch that requires an adult to push," he said. "The staff have always assumed he couldn't reach it. From the inside, the bar is lower, Vera said. If he climbed the headboard of the crib or something nearby, he could have reached it. Children work out that kind of thing. They have time and motivation. Holt looked at her for a moment. You noticed the latch. I notice things. So I'm gathering. He closed the ledger. You'll remain on staff. But you're being moved to the children's wing for 7 days. I'm a laundress. You'll continue to be a laundress in the children's wing for 7 days, he said. The prince's linens need washing the same as anyone else's. He stood. Consider it reassignment pending review. Do not leave the designated areas. Do not interact with the prince beyond what the role requires. She wanted to say that the role required nothing, that she had no interest in interacting with a royal child, that she had come here to go unremarked, to be a notation in a ledger, to disappear into the work until Brecht's people stopped looking for her. She wanted to say that whatever the boy thought he had recognized, he was wrong, because she was nobody, because she had nothing, because wolves did not find people without wolves. She said none of it. Understood, she said. Holt picked up his cup and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The prince hasn't responded to anyone in the children's wing in 6 months, he said. He was not looking at her. He came down 4 flights of stairs before 6 in the morning to sit on your laundry floor. He paused. I have no explanation for that. He left. Vera sat in the empty room for a moment after he was gone. Outside the window, she could hear the palace beginning its morning. Carts on stone, voices calling across the yard, the ordinary machinery of a place that did not stop for anything. She pressed her fingers flat against the table. Her wolf had been quiet her entire life, suppressed, managed, reduced to something that flickered at the edges of her senses and never broke the surface. She had trained herself to keep it that way, the way some people train themselves not to flinch. Repetition, endurance, will. But in the moment, the boy had leaned toward her, that small, wordless lean. Something had moved in her chest. Not warmth, sharper than warmth. A recognition without a referent, the way you know a sound before you know its source. She took her hands off the table and stood. 7 days. She could manage 7 days without anything being discovered. She would do the work, keep her distance, and when the 7 days were finished, she would be back in the laundry, and this would be a strange footnote in an already strange month. She walked to the door and opened it. Eli was sitting in the corridor outside, back against the wall, bare feet on the stone floor, waiting. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those steady amber eyes and did not move. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and looked down at the boy who had somehow descended 4 flights of stairs and 2 floors of a palace to sit beside a woman he had never met. And she said the only thing she could think of. You need shoes, she told him. He stood up and held out his hand. She did not take it immediately. She stood there in the corridor of a palace she had not planned to stay in a life she had not planned to have, with a child who had not spoken a single word in 2 years, reaching his hand toward her with the absolute patience of someone who had already decided. She took his hand. She told herself it was only because she needed to get him back upstairs before someone else came looking. She told herself that for the entire walk back to the children's wing. By the time they arrived, she had almost started to believe it. The 7 days had a shape to them by the 3rd morning. Vera woke before the bell, dressed in the dark, and walked the corridor to the children's wing with the same route she had mapped on the first day. Eli was always awake when she arrived. She did not know how he knew, whether he heard her footsteps before they were loud enough to hear, whether he felt some shift in the air, whether it was simply that he had learned her schedule faster than she had learned his. She stopped trying to figure it out after the 2nd day. The fact was the fact. She arrived, and he was already sitting up in his crib with his hands on the rail, waiting. She changed his linens. She brought water for washing. She handed him his cup and watched him drink, and then set it down with the deliberate care of someone who had been told that cups were important. These were tasks. She could perform tasks without attachment. She had been performing tasks without attachment for years. The problem was that tasks led to proximity, and proximity was where her management broke down. On the third morning, she was folding a stack of small shirts when Eli brought her a wooden horse from across the room. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it, turned it over in her hands, set it on the table, and went back to the folding. He waited. Then he retrieved the horse and brought it back. She took it again. He sat down on the floor beside her feet and appeared satisfied with this arrangement in a way she could not explain. She did not pick him up. She did not sing. She kept her hands busy with the work and kept her eyes on the work and told herself that whatever was happening in her chest when he made that small, contented sound, the sound he made when something in the room had settled to his satisfaction, was not her problem to name. Her problem was the woman watching from the doorway. She had noticed her on the first day, a nursemaid named Pell, whose shift technically ended at noon, but who had twice lingered near the passage door with no visible reason. On the second day, Vera watched Pell tuck a folded paper into her apron between tasks. And on the third day, she watched Pell leave the wing at a different hour than usual and return with her apron recently straightened. Pell was reporting to someone. The question was not whether, that was already answered. The question was what, and who, and what they intended to do with the information. Vera spent the fourth morning giving Pell exactly what she needed to see: competent, distant, unremarkable. She kept the correct physical space between herself and Eli. She addressed him only when the work required it. She let Pell see a woman doing a job. Whatever story Pell was assembling, Vera wanted it boring. In the afternoon, she asked one of the other nursemaids, a tired woman named Britta, who had worked the children's wing for 12 years and had the particular exhaustion of someone who answered the same questions from too many different people, who oversaw the household appointments. "Holt manages staff," Britta said, without looking up from the mending in her lap. "But Lady Drusilla reviews the household roster once a week. She has since the Queen died." Vera nodded as if this were routine information she had simply not gotten around to asking yet. "What's she like?" "Thorough," Britta said. The word had edges in it. That night, Vera lay in her room and considered what she knew. Drusilla was a senior counselor, which meant she had legitimate authority over household matters and did not need to explain herself when she asked questions. Pell was her instrument. The information flowing from Pell to Drusilla was information about Eli and Vera, which meant Drusilla had been watching the situation long enough to install a source before the 7 days were finished. She had not acted to remove Vera yet, which meant she was waiting for something, or that something else was already in motion, and Vera's removal would happen as part of it rather than as its own event. Vera turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling. She had come here to disappear. She was, by any measure, failing at that. But leaving now would be more dangerous than staying. Brecht's reach did not extend to Ashvale under normal circumstances, but a woman who fled a palace assignment without cause drew attention. And attention led to questions, and questions led back to Denmore. She would stay. She would be careful. She would find out what Drusilla was planning before it happened. She was not passive about it. That was the difference she held on to. On the 5th day, she met the king. She had not expected it. She had seen him once at a distance, a figure crossing the yard below the children's wing window while she was washing the sill, and had noted his height and the set of his shoulders and moved on. He was a fact of the place, like the walls. She did not think about facts of the place. But on the 5th morning, after she had settled Eli in the garden with his wooden horse and a collection of smooth stones he had found near the gate, she looked up and found a man standing at the far end of the garden path who was not a guard. He was watching Eli. She knew him immediately, not from the descriptions she had overheard, but from the way the 2 guards near the gate straightened without a word or signal, the kind of adjustment that happened below conscious thought. The king did not look at the guards. He did not look at her. His attention was entirely on his son, and whatever was in that attention was not light. Eli had not seen him yet. Eli was arranging his stones in a line with the focused intensity he brought to everything, testing each placement, occasionally picking one up and examining it before setting it down somewhere else. Vera kept working. She wrung out the cloth she had been using on the window box, hung it over the edge, and began on the next section. Her hands were steady. She did not make any change in her behavior that could be read as acknowledgement or performance. After a moment, Eli looked up. He saw his father. Something moved through his face. Not quite what she expected. Not joy, not fear. Something more complicated, the expression of a child who wants something badly and has not yet decided whether to reach for it. The king did not move toward him. Eli went back to his stones. She watched this without appearing to watch it. She had become skilled at that, looking at something directly while her posture and movement said she was looking elsewhere. It was a useful skill. It was also the skill of someone who had spent a long time around people who did not like being observed. The king stayed for perhaps 10 minutes. He did not speak. He did not approach. When he left, the garden felt neither emptier nor fuller, just altered, the way a room feels after a window is closed. Eli picked up the wooden horse and held it out in the direction his father had gone. Then he looked at Vera. She did not know what to do with the look on his face, so she said, "He'll come back." She did not know if that was true. She said it anyway. Eli set the horse down and returned to his stones. That evening, Holt came to her room. He knocked, which she noted because people in his position did not typically knock on servants' doors, and when she opened it, he was holding his ledger loosely at his side instead of consulting it, which meant this was not a formal visit. "The king wants the investigation into your background accelerated," he said. "I'm sending to the village you named in the coming days." "You won't find much," she said. "It's a small place." "That's fine. I'm not looking for much." He paused. "I'm also looking into Denmore." She kept her expression level. "Why Denmore?" "Because you're from Denmore," he said. "You didn't mention it on your intake form, but 2 of the Eastern Road Guards remember a woman matching your description, passing through the checkpoint from the Denmore direction 5 days before you arrived here." He was not accusing her. His tone was the same as when he had asked about the morning schedule on the day of the interrogation. Methodical, practical, following the shape of a thing to its end. "Denmore was destroyed," she said. "Pack conflict." "I know. That's in the regional reports." He held her gaze. "Is there anything you want to tell me before I send someone there?" She considered it. She considered it the way she would consider a door that could open into 2 different rooms, depending on which way you turned the handle. "No," she said. He nodded. He did not look satisfied or dissatisfied. 7 days end tomorrow," he said. "Given the situation with the prince, the king has decided to extend the arrangement for another week." She said nothing. "You'll stay in the children's wing," Holt said. "Same conditions." He turned to go. "Lock your door at night." She looked at his back. "Is that a general recommendation?" He paused. "It's a specific one." He left. She closed the door and stood in the narrow room and turned over what he had said and what he had not said. He knew about Denmore. He was going there. Whatever was in Denmore, the wreckage of the market square, the survivors who had scattered to other villages, the specific people who knew specifically about her and Brecht, Holt would find some of it. The question was what he would do with it when he did. The 6th and 7th days passed with the texture of something that had not yet decided what it was. She did her work. She kept her distance from Eli in the technical sense. She did not initiate contact, did not seek closeness, while understanding that the distance was largely theoretical because Eli simply ignored it. On the 6th evening, she woke at some hour between midnight and dawn to the sound of crying from down the corridor. She lay still for a moment. The crying had the specific quality of exhaustion, not distress. A child who had been awake too long, whose body was running on something that did not have a name yet. She did not move. The crying continued. She heard footsteps, a nursemaid's voice, the kind of sound a person makes when they are trying very hard to help. The crying did not stop. She heard it change registers from exhaustion into something rawer. She pressed her hands flat against the mattress. She had not heard him this clearly before. The children's wing was 2 corridors over from the servants' room she had been given, which should have made it inaudible. She was hearing it the way she heard things when she stopped managing. When she let the edges of her senses expand past the careful border she maintained. She pulled them back in. The crying was still there, but dimmer, filtered. She lay awake until it stopped. In the morning, Eli was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Slower, shadows under his eyes, the wooden horse held loosely in one hand without purpose. She changed his linens and brought his breakfast and sat on the floor when he sat on the floor, close but not touching, and after a few minutes he leaned sideways until his head was resting against her arm. She did not pull away. She looked at the window. The morning light was doing something particular to the dust in the air, catching it and making it briefly visible before it drifted out of the beam. She watched it and felt the weight of his head against her arm, and said nothing and did nothing, and told herself, for the last time, that this was temporary. She stopped believing it somewhere between that thought and the next. On the evening of the 7th day, Holt appeared again with a formal extension notice written in the king's hand and sealed with the household mark. She took it and read it. The language was administrative. It did not explain the reason for the extension. It did not need to. She had been watching Pell watching her for a week, and she knew what was coming had nothing to do with laundry. She folded the notice and set it on the shelf. From down the corridor came the sound of the bell marking the evening watch. She had 12 days left before Holt returned from Denmore, by her estimation. 12 days in which Pell would continue reporting to Drusilla, in which the king would continue appearing at the edges of things without entering them, in which Eli would continue reaching for her in the specific way he reached. Not demanding, not performing, just certain. She sat on the edge of the mattress and thought about what certainty looked like from the inside for someone who had spent 8 years making sure no one could find anything in her worth being certain about. She did not have an answer. She lay down, and she stared at the ceiling, and she waited for morning. The summons arrived on the 13th morning. Not a summons by name. Vera's name was not on it. It was a general notice posted in the servants' corridor. All household staff assigned to active royal wings were required to be present in the Great Hall for a formal court session at the second bell. Attendance was not optional. The notice was signed by Lady Drusilla. Britta read it over Vera's shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a sigh. "Appointment announcements," she said. "She does these every few months. Very formal, very long." She pulled her apron straight. "Wear something clean." Vera wore something clean. She had known something was coming. The pace of Pell's reports had changed in the last 3 days. Shorter gaps between her disappearances from the wing, a new tension in the way she moved around Vera, the careful avoidance of eye contact that meant she knew something Vera did not. Drusilla had been building toward a specific moment, and this was it. The question was what the moment was for. She arrived in the Great Hall early enough to secure a position near the back left wall, behind the cluster of senior household staff, with a clear sightline to the front of the room and a clear path to the side door if she needed it. She had been in the hall twice before, both times briefly. It was a large space, stone columns, high windows that admitted the morning light in long angled bars, a raised platform at the front where the king's chair sat, flanked by the council table. The room filled slowly with the specific mixture of people that formal sessions produced. Lords and their attendants on the right side, senior palace staff along the left, guards at intervals along the walls. Lord Caston arrived with 4 attendants and took a position near the council table that told her everything about his relationship with Drusilla before she saw them exchange a single word. He was a large man, white-haired, with the bearing of someone who had been important for long enough that importance had become indistinguishable from his posture. He surveyed the room the way a person surveys property. Drusilla entered 3 minutes before the bell. She did not look at Vera. She did not look at anyone in particular. She moved to her position at the council table and arranged her documents with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed this action hundreds of times and found it neither tedious nor interesting. The bell rang. The king entered from the side passage. Vera had not been in the same room as Rhett since the morning in the garden, and the garden had offered distance. Here, there was none. He walked to the raised platform with the specific weight of a man carrying a decision he had not finished making, sat and looked out at the assembled room with eyes that swept across it in a single pass. She did not look away in time. His gaze moved on without stopping. She did not know if he had seen her. She told herself it did not matter. Drusilla rose. The presentation was exactly what Britta had described. Formal, structured, built on a foundation of political logic that had been carefully constructed to feel inevitable. The matter of Prince Eli's development. The matter of appropriate guidance for a future Alpha King. The matter of a structured tutorship, one befitting the heir's station, administered by someone with the correct bloodline, the correct training, the correct standing in the noble houses. The name she presented was Lady Pema of the House of Calvert, a woman of 30, unmarried, from a family with 3 generations of service to the crown. She stood when her name was called, near the front of the room, and inclined her head with the practiced restraint of someone who had prepared for this moment without appearing to have prepared for it. Then Eli was brought in. He came from the side door with his nursemaid, dressed in the small formal clothes that someone had put him in for the occasion. Dark fabric, properly fitted, the kind of outfit that said this was a moment meant to be remembered. He looked at the room. He looked at Lady Pema, who smiled at him with the careful warmth of someone being evaluated while smiling. He did not react. He stood with his nursemaid's hand on his shoulder and looked around the room with the methodical attention he brought to new spaces, and Vera watched him do it from her position near the back wall and stayed very still. His gaze moved across the assembled staff. She saw the moment he found her. It was not dramatic. His face did not change, but his body shifted, the particular shift of a compass needle finding north, small and absolute. And then he was moving. The nursemaid reached for his shoulder and found empty space. He was already walking, and the crowd parted for him without entirely meaning to, the involuntary adjustment of people who see a small person moving with that kind of certainty. He walked the full length of the room. He stopped in front of Vera. The hall had gone quiet before he stopped. That particular quiet that happens when a room full of people all hold their breath at the same moment without deciding to. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the stone at her back. As a fact of the situation she could not alter. Eli looked up at her. She looked down at him. He said, "Mama." One word, clear, unhurried, with the absolute conviction of someone who had been waiting to say a specific thing to a specific person and had simply been waiting for the right moment. The quiet in the hall changed quality. She moved first. She crouched to his level and kept her voice low and level and said, "Eli, that's not right. Come on." She looked toward the nursemaid, who was standing frozen 6 feet away. "He needs to go back." Eli put his hand on her face. She went still. His palm was very small and very warm, and he pressed it against her cheek with a gentleness that had no business existing in a 2-year-old. And he looked at her with those amber eyes and said nothing else. He did not need to. He had already said the thing, and the thing was already in the room, and the room had already heard it. She straightened, carefully, without removing his hand from the air where it hovered. She addressed the nursemaid. "Please take him. The girl should step away from the prince." Drusilla's voice carried across the hall without being raised. It was the voice of someone who had learned that volume was for people who were not certain they would be obeyed. Vera stepped back. Eli followed her. She stopped. He stopped. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. He was not performing anything. He was not being difficult. He simply could not understand, at a functional level, why moving away from the correct place was something she kept asking him to do. "Your Grace." Drusilla addressed the king directly now. Vera did not look at the platform. "This situation requires immediate resolution. The servant should be removed." Lord Caston's voice followed, heavy and deliberate. "The prince's instincts are clearly being manipulated. The appropriate response is separation." Vera kept her eyes on Eli and her breathing even. She heard the king stand. The sound of that, the specific sound of the chair, the shift in the room's attention, moved through the hall in a way she felt against her skin. not sound exactly. Something that her wolf knew before her ears did. The pressure of attention from a source that the animal part of her had already classified as significant without consulting the rest of her. She had been managing that particular signal for 13 days. She managed it now. She heard him walk to the edge of the platform. She heard him stop. He did not speak immediately. In the silence, she felt it. Not warmth, not the vague sensation she might have attributed to the room's temperature or the press of bodies. This was specific. This was directional. It moved from the platform to the back left wall with a precision that had nothing to do with the arrangement of the hall, and it arrived in her chest and sat there like a stone dropped into still water. No, not like that. She had no image for it. Like something finding its socket. Like a lock recognizing a key it had never been cut for. She exhaled very slowly. Eli looked up at her face and made the small, contented sound. The one he made when the world, for one brief moment, aligned with whatever he knew of it. Suspend the session. The king's voice was even. She could not read it. Clear the hall, Drusilla began. Your Grace, the appointment. The appointment will wait. A pause. Clear the hall. It cleared. Not quickly. Formal sessions did not empty quickly. There were protocols. There were the natural delays of people who wanted to be seen leaving slowly because leaving slowly meant you were important enough to be the last to go. But it cleared. Lords and attendants and senior staff moved toward the exits, and the murmur of voices that had been suppressed during the session broke loose in the corridor outside. Vera did not move. No one had told her to move. She was not certain whether that was an oversight or a decision. Eli sat down on the floor at her feet. When the hall was empty, except for the king, Holt at his right, Drusilla and Caston still at the council table, and the nursemaid standing at a distance with her hands folded and her face carefully blank, Rhett stepped down from the platform. He crossed the hall. He stopped at a distance that was neither intimate nor dismissive, the distance of someone who had decided on a specific position and taken it, not drifted there. He looked at his son first. Something moved in his face when he did. She did not look away from it because it was not hers to look away from. It was a father looking at his child, and it had nothing to do with her. Then he looked at her. She met his gaze and held it, and said nothing because she had nothing to say that would improve the situation. She was a maid. She was standing at the back wall of the great hall while the Alpha King walked across the room to stand in front of her because his 2-year-old son had called her something she was not. She was acutely aware of how this looked, which was very specific and very bad, and equally aware that the only thing she could do was be exactly what she was and let that speak for itself. "What is your name?" he said. Not a question. Quite. "Vera. You've been in the children's wing for 13 days. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not fill the silence. Eli, still seated on the floor, reached up and found the hem of her skirt and held it. Rhett's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Something more complicated than annoyance and less useful than anger, which seemed to be a recurring problem in this hall today. "You'll come with Holt," he said finally. Drusilla rose from the council table. "Your Grace, the appropriate response to this incident." "Counselor." He did not raise his voice. "You'll have your appointment reviewed at the appropriate time. This session is closed." The look that crossed Drusilla's face lasted less than a second before she arranged her expression back into something proper. But it was there, the look of someone who had prepared extensively for one outcome and has just been handed a different one and who is already calculating the next move. Lord Caston said nothing. He was watching Vera with a flat, assessing attention she felt like a hand on her shoulder. Holt appeared at her side. "Come," he said. She looked down at Eli. The nursemaid stepped forward and lifted him, and he allowed it this time. He did not fight, did not reach back. He was watching his father, and his father was watching him. And the distance between them had the quality of something that had been the same distance for a long time. She followed Holt out of the hall through the side passage. Behind her, she heard the king's footsteps on the stone floor, not following, not retreating. standing still. Holt walked her to a set of rooms on the third floor she had not been in before. Not a cell, a proper room with a window and a writing desk and a door that locked from the inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room and then at her. "You're confined here until the king speaks with you," he said. "When will that be?" "When he's ready." He paused. "You're not under arrest. I understand the difference." He looked at her with the particular expression he had been giving her since the first morning. The expression of someone assembling a puzzle and repeatedly finding a piece that does not match the box's picture. "Is there anything you want to tell me before he does?" She thought about Denmore. She thought about Brecht and the deal he had made and the night she had run. She thought about the look on Lord Caston's face as she left the hall, that flat, careful attention. "No," she said. Holt nodded. He pulled the door closed. She stood in the center of the room and listened to his footsteps retreat down the corridor. From somewhere below, muffled by stone and distance, she heard the palace resuming its afternoon. The ordinary sounds of a place that absorbed extraordinary things and kept moving. She stood there until her breathing had settled, and the pull in her chest, that directional, precise heat that had arrived during the session and had not fully left, had receded to something she could set aside. She sat at the writing desk. She thought about what came next, and what it required, and what she was willing to do to get ahead of it. Outside, the afternoon light shifted. She sat and thought, and did not let herself feel anything she was not prepared to use. The king came on the second day. She heard him before the door opened, not his footsteps specifically, but the adjustment of the guard outside, the particular silence that preceded someone whose arrival changed the weight of a corridor. She was at the writing desk when the knock came. She said nothing. The door opened anyway, which told her the knock had been a formality. Rhett entered alone. No Holt, no guard. He closed the door behind him and stood with his back to it for a moment, looking at the room, then at her. She turned in the chair to face him and waited. "Tell me about Denmore," he said. She had spent the previous day and a half deciding what to say, and in what order and how much of it to give at once. She had decided on all of it, because Holt was already there, and partial truths had a way of becoming worse than no truth once someone was already looking. She told him. She told him about Brecht, about the wolf she had suppressed since she was 16, about the night she had heard the deal being made through the wrong wall at the wrong time. She told him she had walked out of Denmore with what she was wearing and had not looked back, and that she had chosen Ashvale because it was far enough and large enough that one more person without a wolf would not be remarkable. He listened without interrupting. He was leaning against the door with his arms at his sides, not folded. She noticed that, the openness of the posture in someone who otherwise carried himself with considerable containment. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Why not report to any of the regional posts between Denmore and here?" he said. "Because regional posts have ledgers, and ledgers have names, and Brecht's people would have checked them. You assumed they were looking for you. A man who sells a person doesn't stop looking when the person walks away," she said. "He looks harder." He held her gaze. "How long have you been managing the wolf?" 8 years. "And no one detected it here." "I've had practice." She paused. Holt noted the absence. He didn't push further. "He's told me." Rhett moved away from the door, crossed to the window, and stood with his back to her for a moment. Outside, the yard was doing its afternoon work. She could hear it, faintly. "You've been deliberately presenting as human." "I've been presenting as what I am," she said. "I have no ability to shift. I have heightened senses I manage. That's not a wolf. That's a condition. That's not how it works." "I know how it works," she said quietly. "I've spent 8 years knowing how it works and making sure no one else could see it." He turned from the window. The afternoon light came in at an angle that caught the planes of his face and made him look older than 31, or perhaps exactly 31. She was not sure what 31 was supposed to look like for a man who had been ruling since 26 and had buried a wife at 29. "Holt will return from Denmore in a week," he said. "Until then, you stay in these rooms. And after?" "After depends on what he finds." She nodded. She had expected that. He moved toward the door and then stopped. She did not know what made him stop. She did not ask. He stood with his hand near the door handle and said, without looking at her, "The session yesterday." She waited. "What happened in the hall?" he said, and then did not finish the sentence. It sat there between them, incomplete, which was its own kind of statement. "Eli chose me," she said. "I didn't choose him. I want to be clear about that. I tried to maintain distance. He didn't cooperate. I know." His voice had changed texture. "That's not what I was going to say." He opened the door and left. She sat in the chair for a long time after the door closed. The warmth in her chest, the one she had been managing, the directional one, the one she had no useful category for, was worse when he left than when he had been in the room. She did not examine that. She went to the window and watched the yard and thought about Holt and Denmore and what he would find and whether it would be enough. 6 days passed. She had 3 sources of information. Britta, who brought meals and talked because silence made her uncomfortable. A young guard named Fenn, who was stationed outside her door during morning hours and had not yet learned that answering questions was optional. And the window, which looked over the yard and told her more about the palace's daily rhythms than she had known from the laundry. On the 3rd day, she asked Britta, as though the thought had just occurred to her, whether Lord Caston had remained in the palace after the session. "Still here," Britta said. "He and the Lady Councillor have had 3 closed meetings since Tuesday. The kitchen's been asked to provide supper service for a party of 8 in the East dining room twice now." She set down the tray. "Whatever they're planning, it's not small. Are closed council meetings usual? Closed council meetings with a lord who doesn't sit on council aren't usual for anything," Britta said, with the directness of someone who had decided that technically she had not said anything political. On the 4th day, Fenn mentioned, in response to a question she had phrased as routine curiosity about staff schedules, that a courier had arrived from the Eastern Road with documentation for Lady Drusilla's office and had been escorted there directly rather than going through the general receiving room. She put this with what she already had. An accusation was being built. She had understood that since the session. What she had not known was its shape. Documentation meant something formal. Something formal meant a charge, not just political pressure. Drusilla had understood when the session was suspended that moving Vera through palace politics was slower and less certain than moving her through law. She needed to know what the charge would be before it arrived. By then, she had already spent days doing what she always did, collecting small facts other people overlooked until they began, together, to point in one direction. On the 5th day, Rhett came again. This time, he sat. He took the chair near the window, and she turned from the desk to face him, and the room felt smaller than it had when he had stood in it, though he was the same size, and the room had not changed. "Holt sends word," he said. "He's found survivors." She waited. "They confirm the essentials of what you told me. Brecht made the agreement with a pack from the Norfeld territory. The attack on the village..." He paused. "The attack was carried out by hired men, not pack members. Brecht wanted it to look like territorial violence." He looked at her steadily. He wanted witnesses eliminated. "How many survivors?" "Enough." Something moved in his expression. "Your mother." She went very still. "She's alive," he said. "She's in a village 3 days east of Denmore. She left before the attack." He paused. "Holt says she's been asking about a woman who passed through the Eastern Road checkpoint." Vera turned back to the desk. She pressed her hands flat against the surface and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed. Her mother was alive. She had not let herself think about it, had closed the door on that particular room in her head because the other possibility was one she could not carry and still function. The door she had kept shut for 2.5 weeks opened now without permission, and what was behind it was not grief, but something more complicated. Relief that had nowhere to go because she was sitting in a confined room in a palace and could do nothing with it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. "Holt will bring her here when he returns," Rhett said. She turned to look at him. He said it plainly, as a decision already made, without the weight of a gift or a bargaining piece. She did not know what to do with that, so she said, "He found something else." It was not a question. "The payment for the hired men traces to a merchant account in the capital," Rhett said. "The account is registered under a trading company. The trading company has 3 investors." He looked at her. "One of them is Lord Caston." The room was quiet. "He paid to eliminate witnesses to Brecht's deal," she said. "Which means he knew about the deal," Rhett said. "Which means the arrangement between Brecht and the Norfeld pack was not a local transaction." She had been still for too long. She stood, because sitting while her mind ran at this speed was impossible, and moved to the window. Below, the yard was ordinary. Carts and horses and people carrying things from one place to another. She looked at it without seeing it. "He has connections to whatever Brecht was selling me into," she said. "That's what Holt believes." "And Drusilla?" "Holt has no direct evidence connecting her to the payment." A pause. "Yet." She turned. "She knows he's in Denmore." "Yes. Then she knows what he'll find when he returns." She watched his face. She's not waiting for the formal charge anymore. She's moving before he gets back. He stood. She had not expected that. The speed of it, the way he moved to standing in a single motion without the preparation most people made. He crossed to where she stood at the window, and the distance between them became something she was aware of with a specificity she could not suppress. The warmth arrived again, that directional precision, and this time it was stronger because he was closer and she was less managed than usual. She held her ground. "She's filed for a formal hearing," he said. "The charge is conspiracy against the crown. She alleges you were sent here deliberately to compromise the prince." "On what basis?" "Forged documents she claims establish your contact with a rival pack." His jaw was tight. "She's asking for a hearing in 3 days, before Holt returns." Vera looked at him. She thought about the forged documents. She thought about Caston's flat eyes in the great hall. She thought about the courier that had arrived 4 days ago. "I need parchment," she said. He looked at her. "I've been in these rooms for 6 days," she said. "I've had nothing to do but think about what Drusilla would do next and prepare for it. I need parchment, and I need access to the household records from my intake, and I need to speak to a servant named Fenn who guards this corridor in the mornings." He did not ask why. He said, "I'll send Holt second. I also need to find a member of Caston's household staff." She paused. "There's a man, I don't know his name, but he works the east corridor near Caston's guest rooms, and he was given grain duty 3 days ago after being moved off his usual post. People move staff when they've seen something. He saw something." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze and held it. Then the door at the end of the corridor opened, and running footsteps came. Small, fast, completely unmistakable. The guard outside said something that was ignored entirely, and Eli hit the door at speed and stood in the frame breathing hard from what had clearly been a committed effort across a significant distance. He looked at Vera. He looked at his father. He walked to the space between them and sat down on the floor with the decisive satisfaction of someone who had found the correct location. Rhett looked down at his son. Something in his face, held carefully in place since he had entered the room, slipped. Then Vera's wolf moved. It did not announce itself. It did not ask. It came up through her like a tide that had been building for 6 days, fed by confinement and fear and the accumulated pressure of things she had been managing too long, and it broke surface all at once. Her eyes changed. She felt it. The shift in how the room's light registered, colors sharpening and separating. Her hands gripped the windowsill, and her knuckles went white, and she could feel her own pulse as a physical sensation in her teeth and her fingertips. She heard Rhett make a sound. Not alarm. Something else. Eli looked up at her and made his sound, the small, certain, contented sound, and put his hand on her knee. It reached her, not like a command, like a tether. The wolf did not disappear, but it slowed, pulled back from the surface, retreated to something she could hold again. She released the windowsill. Her hands were shaking. She did not look at Rhett. She looked at the yard below, and she breathed, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not more revealing than what he had just seen. He said quietly, "How long has it been doing that?" "It's gotten worse since the session," she said. "I don't know why." He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. His expression was not what she had expected. It was not alarm or calculation. It was something she recognized from the garden. The look of a man encountering something he had been avoiding knowing and finding it too clear to avoid anymore. He looked down at Eli. "I'll have the parchment sent," he said. "And the records. And Fen. And Fen." He moved to the door. Eli stood and walked back to Vera without looking at his father, which should have been a small injury and clearly was, from the way Rhett stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand on the frame. "We'll speak again when Holt returns," he said. She nodded. He left. The door closed. Eli climbed onto the chair at the writing desk and looked at her expectantly. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked back at him, and thought about Drusilla moving before Holt's return, about Kasten's connection to Brecht, about forged documents, and what made a forgery detectable if you knew what to look for, about a servant moved off his post who might have seen something he should not have. She had 3 days. "I need you to be very well behaved," she told Eli. He picked up the edge of her sleeve and examined it with great attention, which she decided to take as agreement. She pulled the writing desk toward her and began making a list. The hearing was set for the 3rd day at the first bell after mid-morning. Vera had not slept. Not because she was afraid. She had moved past afraid somewhere around the 2nd night, when fear had exhausted itself and left something colder and more useful in its place. But because there was still work to do, and sleeping felt like a decision to stop doing it. She had the parchment, she had the records. Fen had been willing to talk, though it had taken careful handling. He was not disloyal to the palace, just uncomfortable with what he had seen and uncertain what to do with it. What he had seen was a courier arriving to Drusilla's office 5 days before the session, not 4. 1 day before the servant Pell had been installed in the children's wing. The timing mattered. It placed the documentation before Eli's response to Vera in the laundry, which meant Drusilla had not manufactured the charge in response to the incident. She had brought it with her. The incident had only accelerated the use of something she had prepared in advance for a different purpose. Kasten's servant was named Dodd. He had been moved from his post on a Tuesday and given grain inventory in the lower stores, which was work assigned to people who needed to be occupied and removed. He had not understood when Vera sat beside him in the storage corridor and asked him to describe his previous week, that she was looking for a specific thing. He had simply described it because she had asked in a way that sounded like she already knew most of it and was confirming detail. What he had seen, Drusilla in Kasten's guest rooms on the night before the formal notice was posted. A document case. Kasten's seal being applied to papers he had not drafted. Dodd had recognized the angle of it, the direction of Kasten's hand when he signed versus when he impressed the seal, and the latter was his own hand and the former was not. Dodd had not understood what it meant. Vera did, because by then Fen's courier date, Pell's timing, and the gaps in her own processing record had already narrowed the shape of the lie. She wrote it down. She wrote all of it down, in the careful sequence she had been building for 3 days, and she set it beside the intake records and Fen's account, and the specific inconsistency she had found in the documentation of her own processing. A date discrepancy of 2 days between her assigned room notation and her staff registration, which was small and would have meant nothing if the forged documents Drusilla planned to present did not rely on her having been in a specific place on a specific date. She was not in that place on that date. She had a record that proved it. She did not have Holt. Holt was 1 day out from Asheville by Rhett's last report, which put him arriving the morning after the hearing. She had spent an hour on the second evening calculating whether there was a way to delay the proceedings, and had concluded there was not without it looking like obstruction. And obstruction would be read as guilt by the portion of the council that Drusilla had been carefully cultivating for months. She would have to do it without him. The hearing room was smaller than the Great Hall. It had the specific atmosphere of a space designed for decisions. High ceiling, no unnecessary furnishings, light that came in from the north and did not flatter anyone. Vera was brought in by Holt's second, a quiet man named Garrett, who had been her point of contact for the 3 days of confinement and had said very little beyond what was necessary and had always said exactly what he promised. The council sat on the left. Drusilla was at the center of it, with 2 senior lords on either side. Caston sat apart from the council, technically outside its authority, which meant he was there as a witness or a presenter and had positioned himself where he could be both. The king's chair was raised at the head of the room. Rhett was already seated when she entered. She did not look at him immediately. She looked at the room, catalogued it the way she had been cataloging rooms for most of her adult life. And then she took the position she had been placed in, standing, centered, which was the position of someone being examined. And she waited. Drusilla opened the proceedings with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had conducted many of these and found them uncomplicated. The charge, conspiracy against the crown. Specifically, that Vera had been placed in Ashvale by a rival faction with the intent to influence the prince and compromise the succession. The documentation, Drusilla said, established prior contact between Vera and members of a pack opposed to the current rule, contact that predated her arrival at the palace by several months. She presented the documents. Vera looked at them from across the room. She had not seen them before, but she had spent 3 days thinking about what they would need to say to support the charge, and she had a reasonable estimate of their content. The date she had identified as problematic was there, near the top of the first page. Caston spoke next. He had the voice of someone accustomed to rooms that listened to him, and he used it with the particular confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. He described the rival pack. He described the nature of the arrangement. He described Vera as a deliberate instrument. She let him finish. Then Rhett looked at her and said, "You may respond." She did not pace. She did not perform distress. She stood where she was, and she spoke in the same voice she had used for every conversation in the past 2 weeks, clear, direct, without excess. She began with the date. "The document Lord Caston presented places me in the capital city on the 14th of last month," she said. "My intake records at this palace, signed by Beta Holt and registered in the household ledger, show I was processed at the servants' entrance on the 13th. The travel time between the capital and Ashvale is 2 days minimum by road." She paused. "I cannot have been in both places." She had Garrett present the intake ledger. It was open to the relevant page and placed where the council could see it. One of the senior lords leaned forward. Drusilla said evenly, "Ledger records can be altered." "They can," Vera agreed, "which is why I'd ask the council to note that the ledger entry for my arrival is countersigned by the gate guard who processed me, a man named Aldert, whose post records independently confirm he was on duty that morning. His duty log is a separate document in a separate office that I did not have access to request." She looked at Garrett. He placed the second document beside the first. "I didn't request it. Beta Holt's second did, at my suggestion, 3 days ago, before I had seen the charge documentation." The room was quiet. She moved to the second element. "The documents presented today were sealed with Lord Caston's mark," she said. "I have a witness who observed the sealing. The witness can attest that the impression was applied by Lord Caston's own hand to documents he did not draft." She looked at Caston directly. "A seal applied to another person's document is not authentication. It's endorsement of a forgery." Caston's expression did not change, but his right hand, resting on the table, pressed flat in a way it had not been a moment before. "Additionally," she said, "the courier who delivered documentation to Lady Drusilla's office arrived 5 days before the formal session in which I was first publicly observed with the prince. The charge document is therefore not a response to that incident. It was prepared before it." She paused, "which raises a question about what it was originally prepared to respond to, and whether this hearing's stated purpose is its actual one." Drusilla said, "The servant making these claims has every motivation to fabricate a counter-narrative." "Yes," Vera said, "and Lord Caston has every motivation to fabricate the original one." The difference is that my counter-narrative is supported by documents I did not create, witnesses I did not instruct, and records held in offices I did not have access to." She let that sit for a moment. "His is supported by papers bearing a seal he applied himself." The Lord on Drusilla's left said, slowly, "The courier timing is verifiable." "It is," Vera said. "The gate log records every arrival. The courier's entry will show the date." Drusilla turned to the Lord and said something in a low voice. He shook his head once, shortly, and leaned back. The second Lord had not moved in several minutes. He was looking at the documents on the table with the expression of someone doing arithmetic they had not expected to be doing. Caston stood. "I presented those documents in good faith," he said, "on the basis of information provided to me. If there are inconsistencies, they are in the information I was given, not in my conduct." The room absorbed this. Vera watched Drusilla's face as Caston spoke. There was something there, a small, rapid recalculation, that she would have missed if she had not been watching for exactly that. He was removing himself. Not from the room, he was still standing, still present, but from the specific liability. He was constructing in real time and in public the version where he had been misled rather than complicit, which meant the ground was shifting under Drusilla, and she could feel it. "Counselor." Rhett spoke for the first time since the proceedings began. His voice was even and completely without inflection, which was its own form of weight. "The documentation originating from your office, how did it come to you?" Drusilla looked at him. For a moment, behind the composure, something moved. "Through standard channels, Your Grace. Information brought by a reliable source regarding a security concern." "Name the source." A pause, brief but present. "The source communicated in confidence." "Name the source," Rhett said again. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own answer. Caston sat back down. The Lord on Drusilla's right stood and said, with the careful enunciation of someone choosing words for the record, "I would recommend the hearing be suspended pending verification of the courier records and an independent review of the seal documentation." The Lord on her left said, "Seconded." Drusilla said nothing. It did not end that afternoon. That was not how these things worked, and Vera had not expected it to. Formal proceedings had formal conclusions that required time and process and the proper notation in the proper ledgers. But the hearing was suspended, and the suspension meant the charge was unresolved rather than upheld, and Caston left the room before anyone else, which was its own notation. Drusilla was detained for questioning the following morning when Holt arrived. He came in with the road still on him and went directly to the council chamber and laid out what he had found in Denmore in a sequence that lasted most of the morning. The payment records, the hired men, the trading company, the 3 investors. He was thorough and unhurried, and when he was finished, the connection between Caston's money and the elimination of witnesses in Denmore was no longer a matter of inference. Drusilla's plan for Eli, the tutorship, the long management of a future king's instincts and loyalties, was presented as context, not primary charge. The primary charge was conspiracy and the ordering of violence. The tutorship was evidence of motive. Caston lost his title on the 3rd day. Drusilla's formal removal from council followed the day after. Vera was not in the room for either proceeding. She was told about them by Holt, who came to her rooms each evening and gave her the relevant information with the economy of a man delivering a report. On the 2nd evening, he sat down, which he had not done before, and looked at her for a moment. "You did more from a confined room in 3 days than most people do with full access," he said. "I want you to know I noticed that." "You would have found the same things when you returned," she said. "A day late." He paused. "That's not a small difference." She did not argue with him. On the 5th day after the hearing, Rhett came to her rooms and told her the proceedings were concluded and she was free to go. He said it plainly, standing near the door, with no particular expression. He said she would be provided with traveling supplies and a letter of safe passage and an escort to wherever she chose to go. He said there was no obligation to remain. She looked at him. "Where would I go?" "Wherever you want," he said. Your mother is here. She arrived with Holt this morning. You could go with her or bring her somewhere. The resources for the journey will be provided. Her mother was here. She had known it was coming, and it still arrived like something she was not ready for. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and said, I'll need to see her today. She's in the East guest rooms. He paused. Eli has already found her. She looked up. He located the guest rooms approximately 40 minutes after she arrived, he said, with something in his voice that was not quite exasperation and not quite amusement, and seemed to be arriving at both from an unexpected direction. He is currently sitting on her feet. Vera pressed a hand over her mouth. Something moved through her chest that was not the warmth, not the wolf, just her. Just the ordinary human feeling of something that had been lost being found. She crossed to the door, and he stepped aside to let her pass, and she stopped because she needed to say something true. I'm not leaving, she said. Not because of the bond, not because of anything political, because of Eli. She looked at him directly. I want to be clear about the reason. He looked back at her. His expression was the one she had seen in the garden, in the hearing room, in her doorway, when Eli had walked between them and sat on the floor. The expression of a man who had been keeping a careful distance from something and was no longer entirely certain why. I know, he said. She walked down the corridor. He walked. Her mother was a small woman who had gotten smaller since the last time Vera had seen her, but her eyes were the same, and her hands when she gripped Vera's arms were as strong as they had ever been. They did not say much. They sat together on the edge of the guest bed with Eli between them, leaning against Vera's side with the settled certainty of someone who had decided this was where things were supposed to be and was prepared to wait indefinitely for everyone else to reach the same conclusion. Vera's mother looked at the boy. She looked at Vera. She said nothing, because she had always been a woman who understood that some things did not need to be said to be understood. Weeks passed. The shape of her life in the palace changed without being formally rearranged. She was given a title on paper, guardian, assigned to the prince's household, which was a legal protection more than a description. In practice, she continued to do what she had been doing. She was present in the mornings, she managed the children's wing with the practical efficiency she brought to everything. She appeared in the places she was needed and did not appear in the places she was not. Her wolf settled, not suppressed. That was different from what it had been before. It settled the way something settles when it is no longer being pressed against a wall. She could feel the difference in the quality of her senses, in the way she slept, in the way she moved through the palace's stone corridors with something that was not quite comfort but was adjacent to it. She and Rhett spoke most days, not always at length. The palace had its demands, and he had his, and hers were different, but no less real. But they spoke. About Eli at first, about the hearing, about what came after, about what Caston's removal meant for the council's composition, about smaller things eventually, the way conversation shifts when it becomes familiar, the quality of the season, the behavior of the crows that had taken over the East Tower, the particular stubbornness of Eli's refusal to eat anything orange. The bond was not announced. There was no formal proceeding, no declaration. She had expected him to raise it eventually, to address it as something requiring official handling, and he did not. Instead, one evening, he came to where she was sitting with Eli in the garden and sat down beside her and said nothing for a while. And the warmth in her chest was not something she managed anymore, just something that was present, and she let it be present. I know what it is, she said after a while. I know you do, he said. Eli was asleep between them on the bench, his head on Vera's leg and his feet pressing against his father's arm. The evening had the texture of late autumn, cold at the edges, still warm at the center. I'm not going to pretend I understand it, she said. I've spent most of my life without a wolf. I don't know what half of what I feel is supposed to mean. Neither do I, he said. I knew my mate. She died. I thought I understood what the bond was. He was quiet for a moment. I don't think I understood as much as I believed. She looked at him. He was looking at Eli with the same expression she had seen in the garden weeks ago. the complicated, careful expression of a man wanting something he was not sure he had the right to reach for. She did not have a speech for this. She was not a woman who made speeches. "Tomorrow," she said. "We can figure out what it means tomorrow." He looked at her. "And tonight?" She looked at Eli, asleep and warm and entirely unconcerned with the question of what anything meant. "Tonight," she said, "we sit here." Holt passed through the garden gate 20 minutes later, paused when he saw the three of them on the bench, and made a notation in his ledger with the expression of a man completing a record that had been pending for some time. He closed the ledger, nodded once in their direction, and walked on. The garden was quiet. The crows in the east tower had settled for the night. Eli breathed evenly against her leg, and the cold came in at the edges, and neither of them moved.